Hello, Internet. I am Parsha Becky, and we are back for another week of learning about the Parsha. And if you recall, last week we finished reading the book of Bamidbar, the fourth book of Torah, which means this week we are starting a whole new book of Chumash for the Parsha. We are now reading the fifth book of Torah, the book of Sefer Devarim. Now, the word Devarim can mean a lot of things. One thing it can mean is things. It could also mean words or speeches. And in fact, the whole book of Devarim consists of speeches about things that Moshe, our leader who led us all the way out of Egypt through the desert, is going to give to the Jewish people to prepare everyone for when we enter Israel. Because remember, by the end of the book of Bamidbar, we were basically just across the river from Israel. We were almost all ready to go in. We've gotten to the right place. But before we're ready to go into Israel, which we'll do right after we finish the Torah, before we're ready to go in, we need to learn some more things. We need to make sure that everybody knows everything they need to know. So Moshe is going to give us some speeches throughout the book of Devarim to make sure that we know everything we need to know. And of course, the first Parsha in a new book of Torah has the same name as the book. So since we're reading the first Parsha in the fifth book of Torah, in the book of Devarim, the Parsha is also called Devarim. Now, this week's Parsha starts off with Moshe giving a reminder to everybody with things that happened earlier Parshas, earlier in the Chumash, mostly in the book of Bamidbar. He reminds us about some of our travels in the desert and some of the places that we've come to. He reminds us how way back earlier in the book of Bamidbar, in Ba'alotcha, how Moshe appointed leaders among the Jewish people to help Moshe lead, to help Moshe judge and solve problems, so that he wouldn't be the only leader leading all by himself. And he reviews how also earlier in the book of Bamidbar, a little after that, in Parshat Shlach, how we sent spies to Israel to check out the land. And he reminds us how when those spies came back, most of the spies actually said not so great things. They said that it was going to be too hard to go in, and that people should give up, and all the people got very upset, and they started complaining and saying that they didn't want to go to Israel after all. And Hashem was not happy about that at all. Moshe reminds us how Hashem said that because of what happened with the spies saying bad things, nobody in the Jewish people who was over 20 years old at that time was going to get to go into Israel, not even Moshe. The only people older than 20 at the time of the spies who would get to go in were our friends Yehoshua and Caleb, because they were the only two spies who said that we would be able to do it and that Hashem would help us and that we had nothing to worry about. And that's why we ended up wandering in the desert for 40 years between that point in time, between Parshat Shlach, with the story of the spies, and this week's Parsha of Devarim. We were in the desert for 40 years because of the punishment for what happened when people got upset from what the spies said. And the Parsha continues. Moshe talks about how after that story of the spies, how back in Parshat Shlach, when people heard that, they got very sad and they told Hashem, okay, we're sorry, now can we go into Israel? And Moshe said, hey, listen, saying sorry is important, but when you get a consequence, saying sorry doesn't just erase the consequence. And he told them, you can't just go in right now. Hashem just said you have to wait 40 years, which is what happened. But the people said, no, we said we're sorry, we're going to go in right now. And Moshe said, if you try to go in right now, you're going to lose your fight. People are going to fight you. They're going to stop you from going in, because Hashem already said you have to wait 40 years, and I'm not going to help you because you're going to lose. And the people said, no, we said we're sorry, we're going in right now. And they tried to cross the hill that was in their way. They went up to the top of the hill, and sure enough, there was a fight, and they lost their fight, just like Moshe said, and they weren't able to go in, because it wasn't enough to just say sorry. They have to have their consequence. So Moshe said after that story, we were in the desert for 40 years. And he continues how eventually we're bring up to the point where it's the end of the 40 years, and where Hashem says it's now time that we would be allowed to go into Israel, but we need to find the right place to go in from. And he talks about how a few parshas ago, near the end of the book of Bamidbar, how Hashem was telling us that we have to get permission from the people whose lands we need to cross through and to go into Israel, to make sure that we're being fair to the other people. And we asked the people of Edom for permission, and they said no. And Hashem says not to bother them, because the people of Edom get their land because they're the children of Yaakov's brother Esav, and we have to respect them because they're like family. So we went around the land of Edom. And then we asked the people of Moab, and they said no, and Hashem says we have to respect them. The people of Moab get their own land because they're the children of Abraham's nephew Lot, and that's their land. And we went all around their land. And we asked the people of Ammon if we could go through their land, and they said no, and Hashem says we have to respect their land because they got their land. They're the children also of Abraham's nephew Lot from his other kid, and we have to go around their land and not bother them. So we went around the lands of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. And then we asked King Sichon, a king of the Amori, if we could go through his land. And he, instead of answering, he started a fight with us. He says, you know what, I'm just going to fight you. So we fought back, and we ended up winning the fight, and we got his land. And then we also were approached, the king, his next door neighbor king, Og, also started a fight with us. He says, you know what, I want to fight you too. And so he started the fight, and we fought back. And we won the fight, and we got his land as well. So we ended up with the land of Sichon and Og, which was outside of Israel, but right on the other side. And Moshe reminds us how in last week's Parsha, at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, the tribes of Reuven and Gad asked if they could have that land because it was very good for their sheep. And Moshe tells us how Moshe divided up the land that used to belong to Sichon and Og, and he gave it to the tribes of Reuven and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh, because those were the groups that really wanted that land because they had a lot of sheep that it was good for. And Moshe reminds us that in exchange, those tribes promised that they would be the very, very first people in line when we go into Israel to make sure that everyone else in the Jewish people gets their own land in the land of Israel. And they're not going to go home to their land in the land that used to belong to Sichon and Og. They're not going to go back to their homes until they've made sure that everyone else has gotten their own land inside the land of Israel. And that was their promise. And Moshe reminds us that Yehoshua, who's right now Moshe's assistant, but he's going to be our leader going into Israel. And Yehoshua is the one who's in charge of making sure that they keep that promise. And Moshe reminds Yehoshua at the end, Moshe says, you know, Yehoshua, you're going to be the one who's going to lead everyone into Israel. And don't be scared because Hashem is helping you and you can do it and you're going to do a good job. And he reassures Yehoshua. And that's the end of Parshat Devarim, which opens up a whole book of Moshe's speeches to us before we go into the land of Israel. And before I end my Parsha video, I just want to remind you all that I love questions, and questions are a great way to learn. So if you have a question on this week's Parsha or on another Parsha, please feel free to leave me a question in the comments on this video, or you can send an email. I think my contact email is in the description. Please feel free to send me a question, and I will be happy to answer questions in another video. Shabbat Shalom.